I vividly remember one night trying to get home from work to my apartment that without traffic was about 12 to 15 minutes away from my office. It took me 3 hours to get home. I was a big math and science girl growing up. So I think that somewhere my love of those things and my love of people and community and public service kind of merged.
Patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 144 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much once again for joining me for this interview episode as the summer is right around the corner. Obviously, what that means is a summer of new podcast episodes, of course, so be sure to subscribe to the show if you haven't already. A big shout out, of course, to our Patreon supporters. They are the best supporters for a podcast ever. I really appreciate their unwavering commitment to this program. And a welcome and thank you to our subscribers for this show. We've got another Bush School guest here from a different perspective, talking about a very different topic from the previous two. So I hope you will enjoy the conversation. Today's guest is Kirbie Ferrell. Kirbie joins us with nearly a decade of transportation and policy experience. She studied transportation policy while completing her master's degree in public service and administration at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. From there, she spent the following 5 years covering state government relations for the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Happens to be right down the road from the Bush School in College Station. Kirbie recently moved up to D.C. and now works for the Eno Center for Transportation. Her experience ranges from state funding and finance to topics like emerging technologies, data, safety, and freight movement. We'll be touching upon those topics over the course of this episode. All right, everyone. Well, I am excited to have Kirbie Ferrell on to the podcast. Kirbie, thank you so much for coming on to our program today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, first of all, we have, of course, Bush School connection, A&M connection, and I always just love, once again, connecting with fellow Aggies, and I just love how we can share that element with school and everything. So tell us a little bit about your background, especially the A&M connection.
Sure. So I am originally from Houston, Texas, the Houston area. I did my undergrad in Nashville, Tennessee at Belmont University in international politics and Spanish. I worked for the Tennessee legislature very briefly before returning to Texas to do my master's at the Bush School. I did my master's in, so it's a public administration degree with a concentration in transportation policy. And after graduation, I ended up working for Texas A&M. I spent 5 years doing government relations for the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. So in that role, I was able to handle the correspondence between, it's known as TTI, between TTI and the state legislature. So a lot of my job was sharing the research that was being conducted at TTI, so kind of condensing a lot of engineering jargon into a form that, policymakers could understand, because it can be very, very jargony. So I spent 5 years doing that and had a wonderful time. I learned so much. I was able to work for and with incredible people. And in the fall, I transitioned to a new role up in DC. So I am now in DC working for the Eno Center for Transportation. So a little more federal now, but I still have my state roots.
Well, awesome. I love, obviously, the Aggie connection there, and now you're working in transportation in DC. And the goal, I think, of this podcast, just before we get into our conversation here, which is to kind of figure out why Americans, in a way, feel that transportation or infrastructure is improving and struggling. I mean, there's that kind of common question we get a lot where people are just like, why isn't the road getting fixed? And I can't really say that now because as I'm recording this, the roads are being improved near where I'm living right now in Alabama. So
Yeah.
maybe it's a little hypocritical of me, but nonetheless, infrastructure and transportation are so critical. And so today we're going to really be going through a lot of these major points about emerging technologies and whatnot. So Kirbie, let's start a bit with how transportation and funding and finance really come together. So what can you tell us just about the state of how infrastructure and funding, all that kind of really comes about in multiple states, even with the different varying funding levels and sources that we have?
Yeah, that's a big question. Um, I guess that I'd start by saying I don't think that it is strange that people are still feeling like transportation struggling. There has been a major influx of money into transportation in recent years, of course, with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA. We are now seeing a lot of that funding being pumped into transportation, but this is on the heels of years and years of underinvestment in transportation. You know, we've spent decades taking more out of the Highway Trust Fund than we were putting into the Highway Trust Fund. And a huge piece of where we are now is kind of seeing the consequences of that underinvestment. You know, projects are a lot more expensive now than they were 25 years ago, of course. And naturally, it's a lot easier to conduct maintenance regularly and keep projects at a certain level than it is to allow these projects to decline to a point of having to completely reconstruct them. Having to redo a project is a lot more costly than maintaining these regularly. So where we are now is just at that place of kind of having to revisit projects completely and having to start from scratch in some places. Meanwhile, we still have demand for new infrastructure. It's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle coming together at one time. It's not a problem that's very easy to solve, especially because, like, as you are well aware, in any policy area, it's very hard to have all of your funding needs met. There are a lot of conflicting interests. You know, transportation is competing against healthcare, which is competing against education, which is competing against all of these major policy areas, or which all have very justifiable needs. I guess that where we are now is that we're just seeing this the frustration and people are noticing transportation, but this is a decades long issue.
Absolutely. When we see a road getting fixed, it's such a tangible benefit, for lack of a better term, benefit we get from the taxpayer dollars. And you would think that something like that would be such a noticeable and salient thing. And maybe it is, depending on where you live. However, people just want the best of everything. We have this expectation, democracies, right, of having the best things or having things just getting done. One thing that I'd like to ask you is when funding comes into, for example, like fuel taxes, it becomes complicated because we're, on the one hand, wanting to fund our existing roads and all that, or the potholes or whatever the issues are on the roads. And yet people also will oppose it for understandable reasons, for fiscal reasons, maybe for constitutional reasons, depending on where you're standing. How do you see those kind of dynamics in general, maybe based on your time at TTI, on the dynamics between what is needed for a good transportation infrastructure network in our country and just the everyday, day-to-day salient issues that are facing America, especially nowadays when so many people are struggling to make ends meet?
Yeah, that's a great point. Um, And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head right there at the end when you said people are struggling under the general cost of living now. We pay a lot in taxes, and people are having enough difficulty with inflation, just buying groceries, that when it comes to transportation, it's really hard to justify and to sell and to message that, hey, we don't have enough. Hopefully I get these dates correct, but I think the last time the fuel tax was raised in Texas was 1991, and the last time it was raised federally was 1993. Both rates are around 20 cents, and in Texas, 5 cents of that 20 cents goes to public education. So 15 cents now does not buy nearly as much as it did in 1991. So between that, you're looking at the declining value of that money generally. We also see that VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, is not growing at the same rate that it did between like 1960 and 2000. It's not growing quickly or at all now. We're kind of getting stagnant in that department. So between those things, and then the fact that the cost of construction materials now is skyrocketing, the fuel taxes that we implemented in the early 90s are just not sufficient anymore. So we're pivoting to conversations around, one, either raising fuel taxes, which states have done, or indexing it to some measure like CPI or HCI, Highway Cost Index. People, in some states it's a little bit easier to message that. In a state like Texas, it's not nearly as easy. People are just not wanting to pay any more taxes. Texas has one of the highest property tax burdens in the country, so people are feeling pressed in a lot of ways, and it's hard to message why we need to do that, especially when transportation is so essential. Without transportation, I've mentioned this to you, I fell in love with transportation policy because it is the policy area that weaves every single other policy area together. Without transportation, you don't have healthcare. Without transportation, you don't have education. So it's essential. It's a need. And if the burden of transportation becomes too high, that's going to disproportionately target certain populations and make life further difficult for some groups of people. So the conversation around charging more to get people from point A to point B is not necessarily popular. It's not easy on the communications, and I guess, for on the lobbying front, it's just not an easy thing to sway the public on. So that's kind of where we are now.
Yeah, it's just like I guess a lot of the roads we're driving on, a lot of potholes in our funding.
Yes.
Probably a bad joke to use at the Department of Transportation. But anyway, um, I, I love to expand a bit more on your love for transportation. I guess a bit of a good break between what we talked about earlier with funding and then emerging technology. So how did you find your experiences in Tennessee and Texas and now in the DC area such meaningful building blocks for the kind of work that you're doing now?
Whew. Well, I would say I first became interested in transportation in Tennessee. I think I developed a bit of a fascination for roadway design there, and the efficiencies, or in some case inefficiencies, of getting people out of downtown areas. I vividly remember one night trying to get home from work to my apartment that without traffic was about 12 to 15 minutes away from my office. It took me 3 hours to get home. And it was a rainy evening, but I couldn't get out of downtown to even get on the highway to get home. So I became kind of fascinated there. I have always had an interest in engineering generally. I was a big math and science girl growing up. So I think that somewhere my love of those things and my love of people and community and public service kind of merged. So when I went back to the Bush School, I actually found out that I could do a concentration in transportation policy, and the rest was history. I took some classes outside of the Bush School. I was able to do some classes in urban planning up in the architecture school, and I met one of the people that is now my dear friend, and she heard about a job that was a description being written at TTI, and she connected me with who eventually became my boss, Ginger, and it was kind of all history from there. It was a series of very lucky breaks, which landed me in one of the best jobs that I could imagine with one of the best supervisors that I could imagine, who I just learned so much from. So that's that's where we are now.
I love how you shared the types of people, the specific people who got you to where you are today. A lot of times we like to think that everything it can be done by one person, right? And to some degree that can be true in terms of ability to get things done by yourself, DIY, for example. But there's so many people who are involved in this, and the podcast, of course, is no exception to that. Let's go into the emerging technology now. Now, this is very interesting because everyone loves new technology, right? You've probably seen those lines at the Apple Store whenever a new iPhone comes out, and it kind of reflects the element of novelty and how that brings some sort of happiness, however long that iPhone lasts for people. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what emergent technology is looking like in terms of policy. So you've kind of worked in this sort of field. What can you just tell us about the types of emerging technology that you think are going to be very critical to track and see over the next several years and maybe decades?
That is not a question easily answered because I think anyone in the transportation space would kind of tell you that the technology that we're seeing has been very unpredictable. I think that 5 years ago, I didn't think we would see autonomous vehicle AV technology for, you know, 10 years. AVs are kind of here now. We see the technology in vehicles to an extent, but we're also seeing all of the different challenges that have emerged with operating an AV on roads as they are now. For starters, you have the interaction between AVs and passenger vehicles being operated by humans. You have software glitches. You have unanticipated events that impact the way that software functions. You have different types of methods by which AVs are visualizing roadways. So pavement markings come into play. Mapping of cities. It's such a dynamic and challenging environment, but the technology is impressive. The opportunities are there, and there is a huge space for these to like fill gaps in transportation, whether that is elderly transportation, um, you know, people with disabilities, people with visual impairment, things like that, but it's still a ways away. I think would be the first thing that is super important about this. And the second, and maybe a larger part of that technology conversation is responsible deployment. Irresponsible deployment can set back movements forward, like technological progress, so significantly. You see all of the issues of things that happen with Cruise, the AV company Cruise out in California, hitting pedestrians or emergency vehicles. And that does such significant damage to the movement overall. So I think that when thinking about technology, a lot of these things we're talking about, AVs, advanced air mobility, thinking about Uber taxis, essentially, high-speed rail, these things are still a ways away, and they also apply in different areas differently. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all model for the US because we have developed so differently across different regions. Transportation is just incredibly complex right now, and if you have 5 more hours, we could go through all of this. But as far as immediate transportation technology applications, I think the biggest space right here is data. We have a ton of data coming off of OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, the car companies. So you have all of this data just pouring off of cars, you know, places where people are hard braking, places where, you can make real-time adaptations to places like construction zones. If you see that all of these cars are braking really hard at this certain place. So as far as immediate solutions, I think data is the place to look there. That hinges on us using data responsibly and protecting the privacy of people. But I'd say data has the most immediate impact within the transportation space.
Well said. I love the usage you made of responsible deployment, especially the responsibility element. It seems like a lot of times nowadays we're not taking personal responsibility, or we're not thinking about responsibility as an issue. And you're absolutely right with the unpredictable element. It's predicting technology is a bit like predicting the economy almost. You know that it's going to grow, you know that's going to advance, but you don't know when that's going to happen. You don't know when those struggles are going to come by with the deployment or other technological issues. Not to mention all the legal stuff, which thank goodness I'm not a lawyer because I don't have to explain all this somehow to someone. Let's talk about data. That's super interesting too. I guess I'll raise this question a bit as like a civil liberties-ish kind of question too, which is a lot of times people want these new technologies. They want to see these things work. But as you were saying, or you were kind of implying, you really need a lot of data with this, with the technology interacting with that data. And yet people are always in the back of their minds going to be concerned about companies collecting private data, however that's defined by each individual, whether it's where people live or where their car is, whatever that technology is. How do you see, just based on what you were talking about with responsible deployment, how do you see data as an area of contention or of debate on this idea of balancing enough data for our technology, but also having policies that can protect people's private data?
Yeah, that conversation is constant. And I think that's important. That's going to be an ongoing conversation moving forward. Right now, if you have an iPhone sitting by you on your desk right now, your data is being shared. That can be very unsettling to people because we are such a privacy-oriented country, particularly Texas. I think it goes back to that good actor, bad actor conversation. It's one thing to have data. It's another thing to know how to use the data. Um, a lot of companies right now are essentially just collecting this mass amount of data off of vehicles. It is then going to someone else or to someone who aggregates that data, and then to someone who can actually tell you a story with it. And I shout out to TTI right now and my former coworkers, Michael and Sean. They have really learned how to do this and how to figure out how to tell a story and how to protect people within that story and how to communicate that they are using data responsibly. They have a point on a map they don't have any kind of identifying information about you, it's still hard to communicate that to the average citizen who hasn't seen what this data looks like on the back end. So it's about ensuring that this data is only shared to responsible sources, that it is stored safely, and that only necessary information is being shared within these data sets. It's people being a data point versus having identifiable characteristics and not sharing any additional information that is not required to tell this story at the end. So it's hard, and it's not easy to ensure that it will always be done correctly, and that's where it becomes such a gray area, and that's where it becomes so hard to convince people that all the data out there is good.
Exactly. It makes a lot of sense. And you talked about people as feeling like they're data points. And I hope that there's, again, more conversation just with people in general about data, right? Because then it kind of humanizes the whole process here. So much of this technology, right, is digital with computers of zeros and ones. And a lot of people are probably thinking, well, what about me? You know, it just not me as in like Sherman Tylowski only, but just like anyone who wants to be involved in this. I'm certainly not one to be asked to consult on these things. I can tell you that. I just want to, as long as things like my social security number is not compromised, things like that. That's a whole cybersecurity kind of issue.
I guess if I can add one more thing, I think it's really important for people to understand what can be done with this, like what the capabilities are with this data that we have. And we're starting to see some tangible examples of, like, for example, when you have crash data that rolls in, you're getting that a year later, like months into the following year, so you're still seeing data rolling in from the previous year. So you're making retroactive adjustments to, unfortunately, areas with high crash incidents and areas with high fatalities, which, Lord forbid, that is something no one ever wants to see. But right now, a lot of our safety solutions come retroactively. With the availability of all of this new data, we can start to shift that conversation to being more proactive. Some of my coworkers at TTI have done this out in the Permian Basin, where traffic patterns are anything but typical. They have seen an area that had a fatality. They were able to go in, use this data to identify the exact point where something happened and make a proactive adjustment to that area to prevent anything further. Where oftentimes that process would be after X number of fatalities, not after one fatality. It reduced crashes so significantly.
Well said. I really love how people are so dedicated to the study of reducing fatalities, because a lot of times we do believe that it just simply is, again, the crazy drivers, all that. And it's true. I'm not saying that justice shouldn't be served to those who do really just these awful things and make really, really bad decisions and that are very, very costly. But at the same time, there's also the traffic patterns too. And that's something that we struggle a little bit in our state of Nevada, particularly in Vegas, where we've had a lot of issues with these intersections being so dangerous for pedestrians and whatnot. So traffic patterns, whole other thing. There was this one time I was at this intersection in San Francisco. It was probably the most complicated traffic intersection. I don't know how these engineers do it, but that's why a lot smarter people like you get to work with these kind of really, really smart people. And I get to drive around in my car. So, but let's now go to the planning element here, which I also find fascinating. You mentioned, Kirbie, in our outline here, You mentioned revisiting the impact of highways and community engagement. What are your thoughts on just how planning and community engagement fit together, just generally as a policy area?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the highway conversation going on now is revisiting some of the original impacts of highways. If you go back into urban planning history and look at how these highways were location was decided upon, this practice was inherently, it was a racist practice. It targeted communities of color, low income communities, and it disproportionately impacted certain demographics. I think we have gotten back into those conversations in a meaningful way. I think this is something that was always known. We're re-engaging in that process and trying to the best of our ability, enhance these communities and revisit the impact of major highways cutting through certain areas. So public engagement is incredibly important in this process to make sure that the community impacted has an understanding of what projects will do, and has a say so in what the implications will be for them. Community engagement is not just having a meeting, it's having a meeting in a location that's convenient for people to get to, whether or not they have a vehicle, at a time that enables most people to be there, which means making sure that people who have hourly jobs who can't take the day off can be there. And it's just about making it an accessible and engaging process, giving people an outlet to express their opinions and talk about how these projects will impact their communities and actually hearing that information too. So I think that we're re-engaging there. You see this a lot in Texas. Um, there's stuff in El Paso for reimagining I-10. In Austin, we're talking about I-35. In Houston, we're talking about I-45. We're revisiting how these projects have changed communities. And with that conversation, I guess to pivot slightly, is, you know, removing highways or finding some other strategies can also enhance safety in these communities if done effectively. So if you're able to lower speed in a community, in theory, that should have a positive impact on safety. Hopefully that also has a positive impact on pedestrian safety. So we have opportunities to go through and revisit the impact of just letting people go fast everywhere on these highways. And yeah, so it's just about figuring out better solutions to get people from point A to point B, whether that's in a car, on foot, via transit. Different solutions work differently for different regions. I think planners are trying their best to enable safety to the greatest extent while still facilitating these things like economic development with freight movement and getting people to jobs, getting people across cities quickly enough to be reasonable and for their transportation to be viable.
Safety is, again, that top priority, as we always hear from an airline or a bus or wherever you are, whatever transportation network you're in. And it reminds me a bit about, you were talking about speed. As much as we like to kind of have that feeling like that Sammy Hagar had with "I Can't Drive 55." This was back in the 80s, I believe. That definitely was the speed limits in Texas that are way above that, like 80. So I don't think you can really complain as much anymore. But I think you make some good points about, again, just that element of getting people to be heard. I had a friend of mine who works for he actually still a great friend of mine, still works in San Francisco. And he said a lot of times people will just, even if they oppose a transportation project, they appreciate the fact that they're heard. And I think that's a key thing that we need to kind of keep in mind here. Let's now go into freight movement. Again, I know we're going through a lot of these topics, kind of one or two questions at a time, but this is, I think, really been a great overview you provided, Kirbie, for just like kind of a roadmap of where we need to go, because you kind of inferred, right? Even when you're planning a highway, just a specific highway, it's not going to just take one meeting. It's certainly not going to just take one podcast episode. As much as I love for that to happen, that's it's a little bit of wishful thinking here. Freight movement. So you mentioned trucking and goods movement, all that. If I could add something, this is just kind of from my personal end here, which is talking about freight movement on the water. So we have this act called the Jones Act. What can you just say about how freight movement in general is there a reinvention or something that is coming up in terms of how we see freight being moved around the US? I've seen those autonomous trucks and everything, and maybe that's one of those changes, but what sort of things are you seeing on how our freight, since it's such a huge part of for example, our rail network, how that is going to change, or how you see improvements coming with this particular industry?
That's a good question. um, I
I know you played softball. I try to throw softballs, but maybe I'm throwing too many curveballs. But yeah.
yeah, I think that one was a curveball. Um, as far as technological improvements for freight, there are a lot of opportunities to automate certain things. Whether that is, if we're talking about maritime, whether that's port side or actually in ships. And I'm not the expert on this, so I'd hate to say too much. But I've talked to some folks that I know that within the maritime sector, they're really looking to automate some operations for efficiency. On the trucking side, you see stuff like truck platooning, where you can have a second truck connected to a first truck essentially, and automated trucking. What that looks like going forward and the timeline on that. I know that these vehicles are already operating, particularly Texas to Nevada, I believe. So I think that stretch of roadway is pretty ideal for automated trucking just because of one, the weather. You're not looking at the inclement conditions that you are in Michigan or Wisconsin. So that route is ideal for year-round testing. It's also pretty straight, pretty flat. So there's a lot of testing going on right now to enable us to actually get these on the road, which would help with the trucking shortage for starter, the issue with shortage of truck drivers that we're facing right now. So that's a potential solution to help enable us to better meet the demands of freight moving forward, which clearly are not decreasing. I think that's the thing that I find most interesting within the freight conversation is that it's just continuing to grow. The demand for goods here and how comfortable we all got during COVID, just ordering something on Amazon and it getting there 2 days later, has completely changed the freight conversation and the value of just-in-time goods and things like that. And we also saw the need to improve our supply chains in the US during COVID. Within freight, I think the next few years we'll see an increase in, I guess, goods produced in the US or at least in Mexico and Central America, which is going to further increase the demand on our southern border. So demand as far as infrastructure and demand as far as workforce. So at the southern border, there are also a lot of technological applications to expedite the crossing process, whether that's the inspection process as far as actually inspecting goods or the safety inspection of trucks. I think that there are a lot of differing levels of technology that can enhance how we move freight around the country. I know that doesn't fully answer your question, but I think that's the best I have for you.
I really, really appreciate, again, the kind of answers you're giving, just ability to see where we could be going, especially given the experience that you've had. Again, these questions I don't think could ever be answered quickly anyway. I like what you mentioned when you mentioned the border too, because obviously we're in a bit of a partisan row right now with the border, and I just wish that there were people with cooler minds to address something like freight movement or just technologies on things that could speed things up, because I think you could really get a lot of things done with that. My final question before we get to our reflection question here, and this really, actually, there's two parts of it. The first is, Kirbie, a lot of times we see in the news, again, all this partisan infighting and fighting against the other party. And part of the problem I see is that infrastructure kind of gets caught in the crossfire because it's such an essential element. It's unfortunately one of the few things that can be very bipartisan, and yet part of it is that it kind of finds itself into being attached with these partisan pieces of legislation or appropriations that are clearly, kind of like pork barrel spending. How do you see the current political landscape affecting our ability to, as a nation, despite our differences? I think we should include, of course, the similarities too. Our ability to put together good, comprehensive infrastructure packages, both at the state level and at the federal level.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I have a million thoughts on this, but I don't think that you have the time to hear all of them.
All right,
um,
we'll get the crash course right now. Not a pun, by the way, on the transportation, but go ahead.
I guess that one thing that I've seen is that at the federal level, Democrats and Republicans tend to work together better than I might expect in some situations. They tend to approach transportation as a little bit more of a nonpartisan issue. Transportation is giving people the opportunity to get where they need to go, enabling our economy to perform as it needs to for people to be successful, and just overall health of people. I think that where you start to see things differ is in, I guess, the solutions that we think are best. And I think that happens in every policy area. And it tends to be a product of experience. So when I moved up to DC from Texas, it was a little bit of culture shock for me.
No Whataburger there, I don't think.
Yeah, that's been devastating. That was my last meal on my way out of Texas. But you know, it's interesting, even in engaging with my current coworkers, and I've had these conversations with them, and they know how much I appreciate their perspectives. But there are different views on what is feasible for different regions, right? So, for example, my coworkers that have been in DC for, X amount of time tend to think a lot about transit and biking and, you know, active transportation solutions that are more appropriate for denser communities or are more feasible for these communities. If you tell me to get on a bicycle in Texas when it's 108 degrees outside to ride 5 miles to work, I'm not doing it. I don't need my coworkers to have to tolerate that the rest of the day. So it's, we see different solutions, and you even hear that urban versus rural is even more significant. That gap is huge. There are some air quality standards and things like that in an urban area, you can adjust to those and tweak public transit to better meet those air quality requirement changes. Well, in a rural area, it's not like you can say, we're going to start running a bus for all of you guys. Just the ability to impact things like air quality and emissions, have more active transportation and things like that. Like, it's extremely important for people to not get stuck in the echo chamber of those with similar experiences and understand that life is very different across the US. You know, the US is never going to be one large Amsterdam. It is a process of trying to figure out policy solutions that are the most effective piece by piece. I think that the federal government has looked at a lot of funding challenges, which has been great. And I think that states are better positioned to kind of adjust to local challenges. There's no easy solution to this, but I will say that the IIJA was huge. And I think it symbolized a lot of the teamwork that has gone on at the federal level, and that certainly doesn't mean it's perfect. I think we know that perfect will never be a thing. But I think that the ability to work together to get something like that done at least expresses a willingness to cooperate with one another and a willingness to acknowledge that there are so many pieces of transportation that make it work across the US.
That's a great answer, and a great answer for a question we didn't have time to get to, which is, again, going back to the original question of why Americans feel maybe optimistic or pessimistic about infrastructure. I really think what you emphasize there with, again, this coordination and also just understanding regional differences. I think a lot of times we nationalize things that are too localized to be nationalized, if that makes sense. I now want to get to our final question here. So, Kirbie, as you know, this podcast is all about the 6 principles of Washington's farewell address, 1796. So, out of the principles of patriotism, faith, yet national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, how do you think those things, just in general, maybe you can pick one or two that you think are particularly relevant to the areas of expertise that you're in and just our conversation in general?
Oh, goodness. I think that they all relate in different ways. I think there's a general conversation to be had around civility and how we treat one another in this space and how we work together to get different things done. Um, it's important to acknowledge that what you need in your communication, what you need in your community as far as transportation is probably not the same as what someone in Utah needs for theirs. So I think that within public policy as a whole and the politics sphere, civility is critical. And just kind of having an understanding that there's no one size fits all. There's no one answer to any policy area. Everything is purely a product of your experiences and a product of your surroundings and your environment. And as we are well aware, there's an incredible variety in how our cities across the US were constructed. So your transportation solutions in DC will not be the same as transportation in, Midland, Texas. So I think it's about acknowledging one another, acknowledging differences, and having meaningful conversation about how to meet everyone's needs. So I think civility is key.
Awesome. Wholeheartedly agree. And it's almost like when we appreciate each other's regional transportation differences, it can kind of make things a little bit more interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to this program. I just want to recap by saying that I really appreciate the kinds of work that you're doing, especially bringing that Texas background all to DC, because guess what? DC is not Texas enough in a lot of ways, as you pointed out with the lack of Whataburger. I will say Nevada does technically have a Whataburger now on the Las Vegas Strip, so we certainly have not forgotten the Texas spirit. And again, the work that you're doing, I think, is so important because the future of connectivity, of networks, and the ability for our society to function on all levels. It really relies on good policy and for analysts like you. So thank you again so much, and I really appreciate again all the work and especially all the prep that you've put through for our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. No, this is awesome to get to have this conversation. Transportation is going to continue to be a fascinating and massive policy area moving forward, but it was awesome to get to talk about it, and it was a pleasure to get to join.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens for more content. Have a great rest of your day, and remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.